My name is Ivonne Santoyo-Orozco. I am an architect and an architectural theorist. I am relatively new at BART, and I am part of the effort to mobilize the study of architecture and design at BART. Today, it is my pleasure to be in conversation with President Leon Botstein and with Ross Exo-Adam, with whom I am co-directing the newly formed architecture program. So today, we would like to talk about public space and how the current pandemic reveals problems that have accompanied since its modern construction. Yet before we do this, I think it would be interesting to first introduce the new architecture program and who we are. So I'll start by saying a little bit about me. For me, it has been very productive to have both a foot in academia through my writings and teaching, and also a strong background in practice. So I believe that there is a very productive relation between these two worlds, between the thinking of architecture and the conceptualization of design. So this is because I also believe that architecture has a responsibility to the public, because every building and every urban design project is always, I think, a process of negotiating between the multiple interests and of the public and the state, but it is also entangled, related to wider socioeconomic questions. So I think there is so much more about simply design, but it's about also situating them in a larger context. So the world of design, as I see it, I think comes with a lot of responsibilities. So a designer, I think, must always ask, for whom do we design? And I think this is more relevant than ever. And what are the socioeconomic implications of this design? So with this, what I'm trying to say is that the responsibility of the designer requires, at least of the architect, not only to conceive new future imaginaries, which are super important, but also to situate these imaginaries in a responsible historical context. And I think there's going to be a little bit of this in the program that we are setting up at BART. So these are issues that I bring to the classroom, to my scholarship, and that I'm contributing, hopefully, to the formation of the new program at BART. So I will let Ross introduce himself, and then we can open up the conversation with President Botstein.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, President Botstein, for this great opportunity to speak with you. Yeah, so I think to sort of continue what Ivonne was talking about, I'll also introduce myself and speak a little bit more about the program that we've set up. Like Ivonne, I also have a foot somehow, at least in the past, in practice, both as a designer and an architect, and in academia. In fact, much of my research really draws on the work that I've done as an architect and specifically as an urban designer. My research has, in two senses, been kind of historically investigating the emergence of the urban as a kind of uniquely modern space. So it's a sort of historical inquiry that also has very theoretical implications. And I teach on those as well. But I also do a lot of work on contemporary urban design, architecture, and the ways in which we confront climate change and the sort of complexity of that as a problem. And again, these are things that I also very much tried to bring into the classroom at BART, and specifically even from the beginning. I think one of the things about our program that's unique is we don't somehow treat architecture as a practice that one has to learn by going through more sort of basic and abstract exercises in absentia of the larger let's say, political, social, theoretical questions that they pertain to. So in a sense, the program we've put together tries to see the discipline of architecture as something of a matter of public concern. And this is something that Ivonne mentioned. So it's an aesthetic and spatial practice whose sort of ambitions are to create propositions that reconfigure the way we collectively understand our present and aim for more, let's say, just futures, right? So we build this practice, let's say, around several families of courses, architectural cultures, design techniques, histories, and research, in order to equip students then with a more expansive and experimental attitude toward the field that also at the same time opens up paths for engaging other disciplines spatially. So that's, I think, architecture we don't see as an isolated discipline, and it's actually, it can be very useful as a tool to then look at the world. So we've designed the curriculum then in order to sort of see architecture as both, what we say, as both an argument and an art form at the same time. So something that's a kind of an aesthetic spatial practice, but also one that makes a clear proposition about the world. So we try to teach students that architecture is somehow entangled with and operative in worlds beyond its disciplinary boundaries. But also it's a site for a more transformative and could say even insurgent sort of spatial and material possibilities about the world and ways to imagine it otherwise. So before we jump into the topic of public space, and I think we'll illustrate why we think that's actually a really important thing to talk about right now, I wondered, Leon, if you might speak a bit about what it means to open an architecture program here at Bard, which is something I know you have been and others have been speaking about, long before we were ever involved in that. If you had some insight, or if you'd like to share a bit about what you had thought about, especially seeing it develop under these current conditions.
Well, thanks, Ross and Ivonne, and thank you both for really being the first to really set up a formal degree program and study program at the college in architecture and design. Both of you have touched on many of the important points. First of all, the college has Bard has a long history of affinity to a way of learning which combines theory and practice. In other words, when you study science at Bard, you begin already as a first-year student being involved in the conduct of experiments and doing things, not only repeating the experiments that show you something to be the case. If you study theory in music, you're doing composition from the very beginning and improvisation from the very beginning. If you study sculpture or filmmaking, you're learning the theory, the history, and the practice in an integrated way. So film history, art history, music history are integrated not in the humanities, but in the actual making of the art. So we have a long John Deweyite, if you will, attitude to the relation of theory and practice. The second thing is that architecture is a vital forum to study human society and the human imagination. After the First World War, the French poet and writer Paul Valéry wrote a very famous dialogue, or Palinos. It's sort of an imitation of a Socratic dialogue. And in that, the basic subject of the dialogue was architecture. And in it, he's not alone, a long argument about the relevance of architecture and music as being analogous. There's a long tradition in German philosophy as well, where the discussion of music being frozen architecture, or in reverse, architecture being frozen music in a way. But what linked them in Valéry's point of view was that they were public arts. They were arts that shaped and defined a sense of community, who we are and what we believe, and how we construct the spaces in which we live, not only alone, the building of homes or apartments in cities and rural areas, but how do we actually, what's the public space, whether it be a park whether it be a place you work in, whether it be a school, whether it be a public institution of some kind. How do we envisage ourselves, and how do we represent ourselves in a language that is completely human? Because although there'll be many architects that draw from nature, the materials and the way we use them and transform them is completely out of our own imagination. There's no marble column the way you see on the Parthenon in nature. You've invented it, and the spatial dimensions are invented, just as the sounds that we make in music in a harmonic system are invented. So since Bart has a large tradition of teaching in the arts, as part of the liberal arts, the missing link for us was architecture. And it, as you said, it links the study of society, the study of history, the study of the human community, which some people will call anthropology. These are fancy names for simple things. The environment, the study of the environment. What kind of environment? There's the human-made environment, and then there's what we call the natural environment, which is also human-made. It actually doesn't look that way forever. There's no real primeval forest. If you go to the Bard campus, you'll discover the trees, and people are struck by all the trees. But the trees didn't exist in the 19th century. You could see straight through the Hudson. It has to do with our behavior and the way we live, that the so-called natural environment looks natural. And finally, computation. In your field, is one of the fields that has been most, and music too, aggressively influenced by the digital reality. And we've always taught architectural history, so why not teach actually the doing it? So we were lucky to recruit the two of you to help start the program, and it's a very new program, and it is a perfect fit for a liberal arts education that is both interesting in its own right and useful. Because the skills that students get are not only how to think about something, how to write about it, but how to make stuff happen, how to use materials, how to visualize and realize the spatial, as you sensibility. I want to ask you, which I think probably everybody listening in probably thinks is an important question. So we're hearing a lot about stuff. People are going to flee cities. That the long tradition of urban life that has been so crucial to us, the theaters, the parks, the sports stadium, the churches, the sense of community that urban areas have represented since antiquity is going to be gone. People are going to want to live, and here we are isolated in our own homes. What do you make of how architecture not only will change because of concerns about pandemic, different kind of elevators, different kind of, spatial dimensions in hallways, things that somehow seem to protect against the communicability of disease. Those are practical issues. But how do you think this whole experience will influence the way people think about where to live, the environments, and what they think is even beautiful about the spaces they wish to inhabit and our public spaces?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yvonne, did you want
to? Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and wonderful kind of clarifications of things that are really important for the program, like architecture as a public art. I think with the kind of coming back to Valerie, is incredibly relevant and aligned to what we're doing. It's wonderful, but also kind of what you're prompting is how do we live together? And it's, yes, indeed, a concern of architecture as it is a concern of others. So I think in the context of liberal arts education, it almost seems like it's a perfect fit. Architecture is perfect within the liberal arts context, precisely because it allows other students to see architecture from the outside and vice versa. So I think it's just a wonderful opportunity.
You remember that in 1920s, when in Soviet Russia, people began to design communal housing, right? Now you say communal housing, people are going to say, oh, no, I don't want communal housing. I want socially distanced housing. How do you respond to that as architects?
Well, just as an anecdote, just to add to that, the studio that I was teaching as we transitioned into virtual online learning was to design a sort of collective form architecture, very much inspired in shared spaces and communal. So it was sort of fate that it turned out that way, but I thought it was actually quite interesting to sort of keep an imaginary of that kind of project alive in exactly the moment that public space seemed to be the dangerous space, the space of other bodies and so forth.
Yeah, but also, I mean, I think, we have been following social distancing guidelines, and we have all been separated in our houses, communicating through these online platforms, and somehow inhabiting the internet as this strange and perhaps space of publicness. And I think the questions you are bringing today about how things are going to change, how are we going to respond to this, also have to be situated really in today's news and historically in today's news. So today, everyone, and yesterday, we all woke up to hear what is many protests that are happening throughout the states in public spaces. So public spaces are, yes, an active ground today. So many are seeking justice today, like the streets of New York City, of Minnesota, of Ohio, throughout the states are packed outside following social distancing protocols, protesting against the killing of George Floyd. So this is further mobilizing, it could further mobilize our imaginary of how do we live together in a just environment, because I think the issues that are being laid bare in this protest is that what is happening right now and the uneven distribution of public space and benefits are no different today than what was happening in the 19th century. So I think, this is, something that it is structurally.
But Ivonne, if I may ask you, I agree completely that there is also a historical and economic aspect to the use of public space and cities and populations. As listeners will know, you are you have a personal and professional connection to Mexico, and which is a completely somewhat different society, where the history of public space in pre-Columbian Mexico and then in post-conquest Mexico is enormous, and the symbolism of architecture is fantastic there as well. And there is a great deal of poverty and vulnerability, as there is in the United States, to the virus differentially. And the question is whether you think that the experience of the virus and its differential impact on the poor will change our view as to how we construct and where we construct, let's say, public housing, which is an important thing. We have had terrible experiences with public housing. On the one hand, you have the post-Corbusier experiments, which New York is filled with, and Chicago, which are terrible. Turned out to be not only terrible aesthetically and socially, but also vectors of disease. They are not helpful. Do you think that we will see an intersection between design and social justice in the communities that we live in, either in Mexico or the United States, that call for a different kind of public design for housing for the least advantaged in our society?
Yes, very interesting. And thank you for bringing two of my favorite topics that I have very close to my heart, Mexico, and I do write a lot about housing rights. So these two things are related to it allows us to read society through this lens. I think it's really interesting. In the case of Mexico, public space just has a social. The construction of public space is so entangled, in fact, as you are saying it, with colonial history, with the violence of colonial domination. In fact, it is more than any other space the product of overposing one regime to an existing system. So, when they were designed in the 16th century, they were following the really specific guidelines of the law of Indies. So they were the public space and in specific dimensions in relationship to the church, in relationship to the space of government, and in relationship to commerce. These three kind of axes of economic, ideology, and politics was how we were constructing, or the colonial legacies wanted to construct a specific type of citizen that had a specific modeling, very specific behaviors. And I think fast forwarding this to what's happening today in relationship to housing, we're still seeing the legacy of public space sometimes as operating in this triangle, serving, yes, as a space of control, as a space of commodification, and as a space where certain ideological concepts of what a citizen should be are still. I'm actually doing some research at the moment of current models of contemporary models of low-income housing in Mexico.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I once had to contribute to a catalog on the Austrian architect Josef Frank, who later had a career not only in Austria, but outside of his native Austria. But after the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919, the Viennese government, which became socialist, developed a model, a place called Karl-Marx-Hof now, which is an architectural jewel and an ideal resolution of public housing for the poor. And I was interested that it was the epidemic as much as the First World War that, because Vienna was very hard hit by the influenza of 1918. Klimt died in it. Sheila died. I mean, it was really a devastating experience. And I think old cities have always had a long history as vectors of disease. This is not new this is in the days of cholera, in the days of the Black Plague, and so. So I'm curious whether you think, given the presence of environmental conservation and concern for the environment and concern for an aesthetic which is no longer a brutalist, modernist aesthetic, whether you think there is a visual, a new idea of a more humane solution to public housing.
That's a very good question. Are you asking this to Ivonne or to both of us?
Both of you. Ross.
I would like Ross to answer to this, especially because his research deals with how 19th century and the emergence of the city of 19th century coincided with questions of sanitation, public health. But he's also very interested in questions of climate change. So I think you should respond, Ross. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think in terms of a kind of a language, an architectural language that might be emerging in terms of a future, housing or sort of, in a way, urban configuration is really still up for grabs at the moment. There's a dominant, let's say, aesthetic right now that has come out really from the sort of mainstream architecture that, responding to questions of housing, responding to questions of climate change, that is somehow, how to say, it's a kind of a language that plays much more in tones of green and blue, i.e. the waterfront aesthetic object, than in specifically architectural terms. So landscape, in a way, is the predominant, let's say, aesthetic site of invention, if you want, at the moment within this kind of context. And I think it's still largely up for grabs. And in fact, part of our program's agenda is to experiment specifically in this realm. Like, how do we imagine a kind of future, how do we construct future imaginaries through architectural means, through representations, through drawings and so on, that can speak to some of the issues of our present. In terms of, I think anytime we talk about housing, anytime we talk about public space in general, I think we'd be remiss to speak about public space specifically thinking about the parks, the streets, so much that we kind of come when we first think about a public space that we think of. Indeed, it is questions of housing. It is questions of public institutions, public forms of transportation, public healthcare, and so on, that really form a constellation. So in a way, we can't imagine one without the other, which is why, in a way, a lot of the sort of Corbusian-inspired modernist housing in the States has had a lot of problems, because, of course, it also incorporates other questions of over policing certain racialized spaces and so forth. I think, when we look at the construction of public space historically, it coincides very much with the agendas of public health and hygiene, right? The miasmas that I know we've talked about before, and the sort of the circulation of disease in the air was really a concern for a lot of 19th century planners. And I think, we, in a way, like public space, in a sort of Arendtian sense, Hannah Arendt, her claim being that in the 19th century, of course, that the notion of the public was somehow dissolved into something else, something somewhat more vulgar and so forth. In the same sort of sense, we can look at a lot of 19th century urban inventions, such as Haussmann's reconstruction of Paris, or Ildefons of Cerda's development of the Eixample, and many others, as really also the creation of public space that was never quite public. It was also always something of a space of utility, of whether that's for public health purposes, for the circulation of commerce and people and so on, and less so for, in fact, explicitly less so in someone like Cerda, for the gathering of people in a more classic sense of publicness. So I mean, I think, again, the question of public space is somehow always fraught with contradictions and problems that I think also speak very much to today's space. And I think these are, for us, really central, like both these histories and their analysis, let's say, in the present, are really the kind of, give us a kind of, let's say, ecosystem in which to imagine otherwise, imagine public space, urban space otherwise. And that, again, isn't just locatable in something like public housing or public parks, but I think it's really the relations. And I think, the relationality between these things is crucial for us in how we build the program.
When you speak about the public spaces built by Haussmann, or the development of the Ringstrasse, for example, in Vienna, which is approximately the same period, they created beautiful, what we now consider to be beautiful, yes, open, wide spaces, which also had a nationalist agenda. The way Washington, you go to Washington, what's your impression about the public space in Washington? Is the swelling of patriotism. Right. Even the Reforma, in Mexico City, or Chapultepec, as it was reconfigured, or the placement of the Archaeological Museum of Mexico, or any of those things, as Ivonne suggested, even the design of cathedrals and zócalos and markets. All of these things have a variety of ways being read. I have one question of the two of you, which I think many of the viewers might be interested in. I've always wondered, and I've never had a good answer from anybody about it, why are, with very few exceptions, hospitals so terribly designed? Why is it that every healthcare facility looks and feels dreadful? Bad lighting, low ceilings. It looks like barely has it gives you none of the impression of grandeur and comfort and space. I mean, a less aesthetically pleasing, and these are for people who are ill. You would think it should be the opposite.
Yeah.
But it is, and it can't be only that. Is it true that good design is more expensive? I don't think so. and we've built a lot of buildings on our campus, by Frank Gehry and Raphael Vignoli and Deborah Burke, and Deborah Burke, and by Kathy Simon, and by a variety of terrific architects, and Robert Venturi, and so. And it was never more expensive to build a good building. Why is hospital and healthcare facilities, why are they so uniformly terrible?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great question. On the one hand, you are making a perfect argument to have an architecture program during these times. Yes, I think, I don't think this has been a universal question. There are beautiful sanatoriums that were built as a result of tuberculosis, right? So yes. I think there is definitely a way to think architecturally and in terms of health that can be a totally different world. I think this is when we begin to speak about kind of relationships between private interests, the commodification of public health, and the interiorization of public life. Because when we enter sometimes in a hospital today, it's a large interior, right? We enter and we almost feel we're in a shopping mall or in an airport, where suddenly we're in this inside. We're always inside. It's always an interiorized, and it's really the opposite of the beautiful sanatoriums that were conceived as a result of tuberculosis, for example. I think there is a way to think of. Funny enough, actually, Ross and I, we did a project at some point looking at the history of the architecture of hospitals and proposing a new form of hospitals. And basically, our proposal involved something we call the urbanization of hospitals, which is basically they are these cancerous spaces that are just growing without limits. And so what will it be of a hospital and those dimensions if we look at them to the point of view of if we understand it as if we will be understanding a city. So that was kind of like a proposal. And this is kind of like the interesting thing about architecture for those that are watching us, that, for example, our proposal was not just based on a vision that we had. It was really, we looked historically at how the relationship between hospitals and health has been constructed historically. We produced a little genealogy of the typological differences that it involved in order to just reimagine. And I think that's something that architecture has, a project. It always projects, just like that word said, it always projects into the future.
What you say is interesting, and one thing that may be useful in a course in the future is that our partner institution in the Open Society University Network, this new international network that we're at the core of, is a Central European University in Budapest originally, now moving to Vienna, which I happen to be the chairman of the board there. But we're very lucky that we are moving to one of the few great architectural gems of health facility, and that is the Otto Wagner Steinhof, which is, as you know, a monument, architectural monument with multiple pavilions, a theater, a magnificent, the greatest of the turn of the century churches at the top of it, and that will be the new permanent home of the Central European University, courtesy of a very generous arrangement with the Viennese government. But and when you look at that space designed, I think, in 1908, what you say makes a lot of sense. There is a way to do this, which we're not doing.
Right.
Ross, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, just to say, add on a bit about that. I mean, the hospitals that we encounter today in many cities are really this kind of accumulation of a very piecemeal logic that comes in part through the economic structures to which they're subject. So this is, and I'm forgetting some of the details. This was back in 2004, I believe, that we did this project. But it's, in effect, what it creates, and this is really, I think, something perhaps more relevant to the last 30 or 40, maybe 50 years at most, of hospital design, that they've basically survived by accumulating bits and pieces. And so effectively it becomes a kind of an interior urbanization by accident, or sort of urbanism by accident.
Yeah. I think accident is the operative word, that especially if you travel in places like in New York City, Mount Sinai Hospital, or or the Montefiore complex in the Bronx, great hospitals where you have the exact, you're going from one building to another building, designed at different times without common floors. You have to go down and up and around and backwards, because it's exactly as you said. It's like a puzzle put together by necessity.
Right. If we had a more robust public funding, we might consider doing that very differently, I think. And so in a way, it's a reflection of sort of larger political and economic values in place.
Well, I think our time is close to up, and is close to being up. And I want to say how pleased we are at having you as colleagues and leading this program, and how important the subject is. And I know there's a new course that you're leaders in for the lower college students. Maybe as closing, say something about that course.
Sure. So we call it Designing Immediate Futures. And in a sense, it's a reflection, like I think many of the common courses, it's really based on a kind of collective reflection that Ivonne, Olga, Tulumi, and Susan Miriam and I have had about this present condition, and about, in a sense, the way that through this kind of rupture of everyday life and the rupture of the larger infrastructures and systems that we sort of come to depend on, we also see the possibility for perhaps the first time in our lives of imagining the future. The future itself is no longer something that's dictated through various social institutions and cultural and political institutions, but rather something that is somehow standing sort of just outside our doors, and in a way that becomes somehow palpable through the fact that we've even seen how much the environment has changed as a result of not traveling and not operating businesses and factories as much. And so I think it's based on that sort of immediate sort of inspiration, if you want, even in a time of great tragedy and despair, to sort of see that as a springboard, let's say, into thinking and imagining a different future out of this. Because I think we know that one way or another things will change after COVID sort of becomes controlled in a way. And there are many versions of this sort of new normal that are passing around, some of which are very scary, some of which are very interesting. And so for us, it's really a chance to see architecture very broadly as a sort of way of seeing the world, and a way then that we not only can see the world and sort of understand it, but also then to project other ways of seeing the world, new ways of imagining.
Ivonne?
Yeah, another thing to add is the title itself, Designing Immediate Futures. So immediate, normally what you would think that when you're thinking about immediate future, you might be myopic. You might not be really kind of having a longer picture. But I think this is in a way kind of trying to ask the students to take some agency over what is happening. We have seen that in a matter of weeks, the whole world has changed. And yes, indeed, well, I agree with Rose that it has been a great sorrow and tragedy. There is also one in a lifetime opportunity to see this as a possibility to reimagine how we live together. And I think we want to give this as a forum to students to think with us how to begin to provoke these conversations and how they could have a long-lasting effect. So we're really excited about this.
Yeah,
I think that's a great place to close this conversation, and I really thank you both, and I look forward to seeing you both in real space in real time, in some public space that makes us all smile.
Indeed.
I am very much looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you
so
very much. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.